The war has lasted over a month. Iran is not only facing intense bombardment, but has also suffered a 960-hour nationwide internet blackout. Independent monitoring groups like NetBlocks show that Iran's connectivity dropped significantly on January 8, effectively cutting some 90 million from the outside world. Even Starlink, which made a splash during the Russia-Ukraine war and Iranian protests, has been targeted by Iran. Devices in Iran. The Wall Street Journal reported that the U.S. secretly funneled thousands of Starlink terminals into Iran, claiming it was to help citizens get online, but Chinese state media CCTV-affiliated social media even produced an animation accusing the U.S. of smuggling in Starlink to help target specific locations within Iran for military strikes. Whether the U.S. military used Starlink in Iran remains unverified, but experts point out that Iran has mastered jamming technology, likely with guidance from Russia. Russia. Although both sides have entered the negotiation phase, the cyber warfare behind the scenes seems even more intense than the fighting on the battlefield.
Hello everyone, welcome to Flying International. I'm your host, Wang Yujun, here to interpret the news and analyze the inside story, as well as the ongoing debates between the two sides of the war. Today is the 41st day of the Iran war, and this week, Trump and Iran reached a ceasefire agreement. Let's analyze how this event changes the Middle East situation and the intentions of major powers. Trump said this week he would bomb Iran back to the Stone Age, which made everyone extremely nervous. Under such tense circumstances, Pakistan suddenly stepped in to mediate, with China playing a role in between. China has remained behind the scenes throughout this process, yet there are reports that Wang Yi has been in frequent contact with the foreign ministers of both Israel and Iran. But why has China been unwilling to step into the spotlight, and why was it Pakistan, a nation that once proposed Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize and has achieved many diplomatic results through its business connections with Trump's close American friends in cryptocurrency, that ultimately saved us from this war? I personally believe this ceasefire is very likely to eventually lead to the peace treaty we are all hoping for. As of now, oil prices have started to fall because Iran is managing the Strait of Hormuz in a controlled manner. Does this align with Trump's interests or not? Let's look at this 10-point ceasefire agreement. It came very suddenly, and we see from news clips that Trump claims his 10-point agreement might not be the same one Iran presented. So where exactly did this agreement come from? Let's also examine what is inside it that might cause trouble for the future of the ceasefire or become a catalyst for future conflict. Let's first look at this, the third point. Iran requests that the U.S. cease all military actions against Iran, and the seventh point, they hope all U.S. sanctions against Iran will be completely lifted. And the eighth point, hoping that the U.S. can return all of Iran's assets currently held within the United States back to Iran. These demands from Iran are, relatively speaking, more acceptable to the United States. We also see a point that everyone is most concerned about, which is the fourth point, how to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. This has become an external issue for the U.S. in this war, because when the U.S. initially attacked Iran, it hoped to change the regime, stop Iran's nuclear development, and prevent Iran from engaging in so many proxy wars in the region. The strait has now become an important reason why Iran might give up nuclear weapons, because having this key energy weapon allows them to deal with everyone effectively and even use it as leverage to trade power with the whole world. Let's first look at why a military operation that Trump claimed would end in 4 days has turned into a total war that, today on its 41st day, has still not ended. Before the ceasefire between the US and Iran, the US was even threatening to use its most destructive weapons to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age. Many news clips and reports from the New York Times tell us that Netanyahu went to the White House to lobby Trump, saying it was the best time to attack Iran because the Iranian regime was very fragile. Furthermore, Netanyahu told Trump he had vital intelligence suggesting that if the US and Israel carried out large-scale bombings and assassinations of their religious leaders, the Iranian people would surely rise up against the regime. However, it is clear that this intelligence did not lead to that outcome. So, during this warmongering lobbying, the CIA director considered such intelligence to be absurd, and our Secretary of State, Mr. Rubio, even used profanity to describe such intelligence. But, even though they all expressed their disbelief in this intelligence, no one except Vice President Vance directly opposed the attack to Trump. Since Vance has been an opponent of the war from the beginning, he has now been tasked with a very important mission to Pakistan, along with Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and the Middle East envoy, Mr. Wolf, to serve as representatives for nuclear negotiations. In this process, the US not only failed to change Iran's theocracy, but also led Khamenei's son, M., to declare that he would avenge his father. So, as we observe this war and future US foreign policy, we must see if Trump has lost confidence in Netanyahu, or if a whole generation in US diplomatic circles has lost faith in Israel. Beyond the military games and battlefield maneuvers, another crucial indicator of this war is how new media, or social media, has altered the trajectory of this conflict and public perception of it. Let's go back to around 2023, when there was a Hollywood film called Wag the Dog. Wag the Dog is about a US president mired in a sex scandal with low poll numbers just 2 weeks before an election, so his aides convince him to wage a fake war in Albania. The entire war is a fabrication, using controlled news media to broadcast pre-staged clips to make the candidate a beloved hero, rallying everyone under his leadership to feel the strength of their nation. So, if this Iranian war were still relying on traditional media, it would be harder to convince the public of positions initially set by the US, and Trump could very well use traditional media to sway everyone. The initial 4 days of bombing did indeed destroy many of Iran's military facilities, leaving their future retaliatory power quite weak, but thanks to social media, we saw two very interesting phenomena at the start of this war. First, Iran used a great deal of old footage to convince everyone that their attack on Israel was, in fact, highly successful. These videos show many successful strikes on Israeli military facilities and even grim scenes of devastation, while using AI to generate so-called military experts to constantly lobby on X about why Iran is by no means the weaker side in this war. Conversely, Israel has been using similar tactics on many social media platforms to tell everyone that there are deep divisions between Iran's theocratic leaders and their military, or the Revolutionary Guard. They claim the country is currently leaderless, on the brink of collapse, and that the people are ready to rise up and oppose the regime at any moment. This deluge of information on social media has left everyone uncertain about who is winning this war, even 40 days in, with no clear consensus in sight. I believe that the war on social media has provided Iran with significant support and boosted their confidence tremendously. We no longer just see Trump using his social media platforms to engage with the international community or the public. We see high-ranking officials from Iran and even Pakistan using X to express their thoughts, whether it's Iran telling the American public there are no winners in this war, or the Pakistani Prime Minister using an X post to outline what to look for in the ceasefire agreement. While there are no winners in this war, some countries have clearly gained the upper hand in this game, while others are affected like mere bystanders. Let's look at the role of the United States. Indeed, the U.S. role has shifted significantly since the war began, and they have changed their strategic objectives. Due to rising oil prices and the cost of living in the U.S., along with a landslide decline in Trump's poll numbers, and criticism from many media figures within the MAGA movement, Trump has shifted his focus. He has moved from his initial goal of regime change in Iran and eliminating their nuclear capabilities to figuring out how to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. After all, Trump is a businessman. He is very smart and knows how to calculate costs, so it is highly likely that his final move will be to co-manage the Strait of Hormuz with Iran. So far, Iran can be considered a major, perhaps even the biggest, winner in this war. They no longer need to continue developing nuclear weapons, as doing so would not serve the interests of any major power, whether it's the United States, Russia, or even China. If they insist on developing nuclear weapons, they risk becoming the North Korea of the Middle East, facing complete international blockade or isolation. Therefore, they have found a better energy weapon in the Strait of Hormuz. Not only could they implement military control and impose fees, Goldman Sachs has calculated that this could generate $90 billion in annual revenue, but by using the strait as a threat and leveraging the fact that this war has prevented them from being crushed by the US, they have effectively become a new power in the Middle East. Since the previous U.S. dual containment policy relied on maintaining a balance of terror between Iran and Iraq, and given Iraq's currently weaker international and national standing, Iran is very likely to become the sole hegemon in the region, leaving Israel a de facto loser in this scenario. Whether it is Netanyahu, who is already facing domestic calls to stand trial for war crimes or dealing with his own judicial issues, he is unlikely to have a chance to govern after the next election. Furthermore, if the current divide between Israel and the U.S. cannot be smoothed over by new leadership or by Trump, Middle Eastern nations, especially Gulf states, will notice this friction. We must continue to observe whether the previously discussed Abraham Accords can be sustained, allowing for commercial development and cooperation in areas beyond oil, such as technology or financial systems. Gulf states are also undoubtedly losers in this war. Not only are they suffering economic losses because much of their oil cannot be produced or shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. Whether it is Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or Bahrain, many of their infrastructure and military facilities have been attacked by Iran. Their greatest anxiety stems from the possibility that if Trump decides to cooperate with Iran, he might withdraw U.S. forces from the region. Finally, when it comes to European countries, especially NATO members, they feel extremely awkward about this matter, and they are truly at a loss as to how to position themselves. First, they all hope to resolve this war through diplomatic means and are unwilling to provide military support to the U.S. Second, this war could extend into their own domestic politics. For instance, in Italy, Meloni's party recently faced a constitutional referendum, and it's very likely that this referendum's outcome was linked to the defeat of her party due to Trump's military actions in Iran. As everyone knows, Meloni could be considered one of the top 2 most pro-Trump political figures in Europe. She is a far-right politician, and she has never hidden her support for Trump. Then there is the other one, Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán, whom our US Vice President Vance went to meet. Orbán is also described by people as the European version of Trump, and his poll numbers are currently continuing to lag behind. I think that among the many countries in Europe, the UK, France, and Germany, these 3 major NATO members, should be very interesting indicators to observe. Both Germany and France are unwilling to intervene in any military conflict, but they have expressed great concern regarding the impact of oil prices and the potential influx of refugees in the future. Finally, we saw in the news that King Charles of the UK might visit the US around late April or early May. While the UK has repeatedly expressed support for the US in this conflict, it has not yet joined the war. However, I think the most interesting aspect of the UK's role in this situation is that they will likely remember to warn the US, much like the US warned Japan back when they attacked Pearl Harbor. When the British king meets Trump in the US, I wonder if he will remind him that in 1956, when the UK wanted to use military force to open the Suez Canal and warned Egypt that it could not be nationalized, the US opposed the British, which not only led to a significant decline in British national power but also eventually made the US dollar the international reserve currency. Finally, looking at this war, it is not just a conflict between major powers or regions. We must ask why China eventually stepped in to mediate alongside Pakistan, and even took on the role of a peacemaker. Because, in fact, when Trump was first elected, he mentioned that he would return to the US to continue drilling for oil. Drill, baby, drill. He hopes that in the future, the US, other major powers, and even the global economy will continue to develop using oil and rely on oil or natural gas as our primary sources of energy. However, there are other countries that are adopting new energy or green energy as their primary strategy for this new type of energy policy. This group of countries is led by China, which hopes to help many global South nations, such as Brazil, Ethiopia, or India, use new energy so that in the future, they won't be so dependent on oil-producing countries. This conflicts with Trump's desire to gain more control over Middle Eastern oil, which would ultimately maintain U.S. global power and the dollar's hegemony. This tug of war may show us which way the scales tip once this conflict ends. We are currently looking at the Strait of Hormuz. If Trump and Iran, or the Iranian military, were to blockade this passageway, all ships would likely have to pay a protection fee or toll, which would cause significant economic repercussions. Many ships might not even dare to pass through, as once the strait is under military control, concerns over soaring insurance premiums or safety risks would make them hesitant to enter. Therefore, many are now discussing alternative ways to transport oil out of the Middle East. One likely possibility is in the UAE, where we see plans for a new canal. This canal is quite interesting, as it would cut through the Hajar Mountains for about 200 kilometers, requiring an investment of roughly $200 to $300 billion, which is, of course, a massive project. If this project is completed, it would change the entire order of energy transportation and even alter the new regional balance of the Middle East, as well as the future relations between Gulf states, Israel, and Iran. And if this canal is opened, what role will the United States play in it? Will it be funded by capital from the United States and these Arab Gulf states? Since they want to develop their financial institutions and centers, they might make this one of their flagship projects, which is certainly something to look forward to. Finally, although this canal may not necessarily be completed, many countries have already begun laying pipelines underground. Most of these are directed toward the European countries we mentioned earlier, and in the future, more pipelines will inevitably be laid toward Central Asia or even Asia. Whether a ceasefire agreement can eventually become an armistice, I believe that staffers on both the Iranian and American sides will discuss what kind of outcome they hope to achieve. For Iran, there will surely be clergy members who hope this war continues until the bitter end, rather than ending in an armistice, because to them, fighting to the death is a once-in-a-century opportunity. Seeing the rift between Israel and the U.S., the hedging of other Gulf states between the U.S. and Iran, and the potential support from other major powers, would Iran really be willing to stop the war now? However, an armistice could bring Iran significant economic benefits. Whether through potential economic reparations from the U.S. or economic gains in the Strait of Hormuz, they would hold a trump card in the form of energy, which might also be a very good choice for them. For Trump, he must consider his domestic political factors. Current economic conditions do not allow for a ground war, and without ground operations, it is impossible to dismantle Iran's theocratic regime. If he continues to launch missiles to fight this war, many U.S. military experts are warning that it is uncertain whether the U.S. has enough missiles to sustain such an effort. Therefore, for the U.S., perhaps they are also eager to reach a coexistence outcome with Iran in the Strait of Hormuz, allowing them to achieve substantial economic benefits as well. So, as we reach the 41st day of this war, we see no absolute winner. But if there is an unexpected winner, it would be the world of cryptocurrency, as Iran has actually proposed using Bitcoin for future passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Could Bitcoin become a new type of financial order? You know it, you know you are being disingenuous, and that only makes the president look bad. You know that you take everything this administration says and try to use it to make the president look bad. That is an objective fact. If you are trying to argue right now that CNN's overwhelming coverage of President Trump is not negative, I think the American people would tend to agree, and your ratings. Given the dignified transfer, is it the position of this administration that the press should not prominently cover the deaths of U.S. service members? No, it is the position of this administration that the press in this room and across the country should accurately report on the success of Operation Epic Fury and the damage it is doing to the rogue Iranian regime that threatens the lives of every single American in this room. If the Iranian regime had their choice, they would kill every single person in this room. We can all be very grateful that we have an administration and many men and women in our armed forces who are willing to sacrifice their lives for the rest of us in this room, for every American across the country, and for every troop based in the Middle East. That is not what the Secretary said, Caitlin, and that is not what the Secretary meant, and you know it. You know you are being disingenuous. We have never had a Secretary of Defense. Tragic things happen. Of users under.
That does make him look bad. Listen to me, especially you and especially CNN. The Secretary of Defense cares deeply about our warfighters and our men and women in uniform. He travels all across this country to meet with them, to connect with them, and your network has barely ever reported on that. You also had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Chairman Kane, who is a brave patriot standing alongside the Secretary at the Pentagon, again expressing his condolences to these families. And I just told you that the President of the United States will be attending their dignified transfer. Please stop trying to make the President look bad, and we expect you to cover that as you should, Caitlin. But you and your network know that you take every single thing this administration says and try to use it to make the President look bad. That is, if you are trying to argue right now that CNN's overwhelming coverage of President Donald Trump is not negative, I think the American people would agree, and your ratings would. In today's Daily Topic broadcast, let's look at the latest international situation. The 2-week ceasefire between the US and Iran is now facing a major shift. We take you now to the US official intervention, with Vice President Pence leading the delegation, accompanied by Special Envoy Wickoff and Trump's son-in-law, Kushner. This high-level delegation is scheduled to head to Islamabad, Pakistan, on April 11th to begin face-to-face negotiations with Iran. This meeting is no simple matter. It is viewed as one of the highest-level contacts between the US and Iran since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The success or failure of the talks will likely directly affect whether the war escalates, and the security atmosphere is understandably very tense. Roadblocks and security checkpoints have already been set up locally, which shows just how important and sensitive these negotiations are. On the other hand, the US stance is very firm. President Trump has spoken directly, stating that US forces will remain on standby in the Middle East. He emphasized that as long as a real agreement is not implemented, US troops and weapons will not withdraw, and should the talks fail, an unprecedented large-scale military operation could be launched. The focus remains on the Strait of Hormuz, the global energy artery. Trump lashed out at Iran on social media, criticizing its handling of oil transit as very poor. He even warned that if Iran dares to charge ships for passage, it better stop immediately, because this strait controls about 1/5 of global oil shipments. If it is obstructed, not only the Middle East but the entire global energy market will face a severe shock. Currently, the situation appears to be cooling down slightly, and as the frequency of attacks in the Persian Gulf region has decreased, there was even a period with no reports of attacks at night. Although the crisis has not been lifted, such as the interception of a drone by the Saudis, the UAE also remains skeptical, demanding that Iran fully honor its commitments and unconditionally open the Strait of Hormuz. In addition, more than 800 ships are trapped in the Persian Gulf waiting to pass. Shipping insurers are still in a wait-and-see mode. As for Iran, its delegation has arrived in Pakistan, ready to negotiate a ceasefire proposal, but it is also emphasized that past ceasefires were repeatedly violated, leading the outside world to question their sincerity. Overall, this meeting is almost a watershed moment for war or peace. While Trump has expressed optimism, stating that Iran will agree to the necessary conditions, he also did not forget to warn that the consequences of failure would be extremely painful. The world had hoped a US-Iran ceasefire agreement would allow Persian Gulf shipping to return to its former prosperity, but the current situation is likely completely the opposite. US President Trump issued a series of stern posts, criticizing Iran for its poor progress in opening the Strait of Hormuz. He accused the Tehran government of lacking credibility and even warned Iran not to think about charging foreign oil tankers. Trump further called out to the market, emphasizing that oil will flow soon, and that he is confident in leading the situation regardless of whether Iran cooperates. Meanwhile, Iran has been taking frequent actions. On the 9th, citing Israel's violation of the Lebanon ceasefire, Tehran suddenly announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and published a so-called alternative route map, claiming the main channel may contain mines. This move is seen by outsiders as pressuring the US. Data shows there are currently over 400 oil and gas tankers stranded in the Persian Gulf, but the daily throughput is far below the agreed limit. Notably, Iran is establishing a parallel settlement mechanism outside the US dollar system, attempting to use cryptocurrency for oil transactions to not only ensure its assets aren't seized but also to structurally challenge US financial hegemony. Following the US-brokered ceasefire, Israel also lifted its state of emergency. The situation in the Middle East seems to have a glimmer of easing, but Israel continues to launch attacks on Lebanon, and the world is very worried that this fragile ceasefire agreement could collapse at any time. So, what about the Israeli Prime Minister? Netanyahu stated that he has already ordered a ceasefire with Lebanon, but military strikes against Hezbollah will not stop. Today's footage shows civilians walking normally down the street, when suddenly they were hit by an airstrike. They fled in terror as houses and vehicles were affected, with debris scattering everywhere. Israel continues to fire on Lebanon. The Israeli Prime Minister suddenly said, "There is no cease in Lebanon. We are continuing to strike with force. I instructed the cabinet to be indirect." Quote. Netanyahu's two major goals are to disarm Hezbollah and establish a bilateral peace agreement. The Lebanese government stated that hostilities must cease before negotiations can begin, and Hezbollah has also refused direct dialogue. The IDF has launched a new round of attacks against Hezbollah. Correction. The previous segment was numbered incorrectly in the source. However, at the same time, the Israel-US ceasefire agreement took effect, and it was formally announced that the state of emergency was lifted. Lebanon and Israel. Facing a strong response, the US Vice President is expected to hold talks with Iran in Pakistan on the 11th. It is reported that Trump is very optimistic about reaching an agreement, and the world remains highly concerned.